Thanks so much, Rita. As Rita said, I'm Sandra Martin. I'm the head of newsroom development at the Globe and Mail, and I'm really excited to moderate this next discussion, which really talks about development. What can we do for young people who are entering the workforce, either from outside of Canada, they're coming to this country looking for opportunities, or they've come up through the education system here. The pandemic has really derailed plans for youth in Canada, and they face a really uncertain future given the rapid change and the nature of work and the emergence of digital technologies, AI, anyone. So we have a really excellent group to discuss this topic, and I will, without further ado, be introducing them right now. First up, we have Agapi Gassese, who's Executive Director with the C Centre for Young Black Professionals. And joining us all the way from Saskatoon is Ian Stavness, Associate Professor with the Department of Computer Science at the University of Saskatchewan. And next, we have someone who's not a stranger to these talks, Shamira Madhany, who's Managing Director for Canada and Deputy Executive Director of World Education Services. So the clock's already counting down. I want to jump right in because I know we have a lot to talk about. So I want to start by asking each of you to briefly explain the work that you're doing related to youth and skills development. So Agapi.
For sure. So I have the privilege and the honor of serving as the Executive Director at C Centre for Young Black Professionals. And what we do is we focus on workforce development and tackling the social and economic barriers that are facing Black youth across the country. And we do this by looking at where there are labor gaps and training them so we can get them from the back of the unemployment line to hopefully the front or close to it. So thank you.
All right, Ian.
Great, thanks. Well, I'd like to start, since I'm coming from Saskatoon, to acknowledge that I live and work on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis, and I'm just really happy to be here today. At the University of Saskatchewan, we're leading a new graduate student training program in computational agriculture. And this is motivated by trying to capture the $11 billion opportunity that Canada has to accelerate the adoption of technology in agriculture, and particularly data-intensive technology. So we are training students at the intersection of plant science and computer science, and giving them skills and diverse teams that they can operationalize those goals.
All right, thanks. Shamira.
Sure. So World Education Services is a 50-year-old organization. We assess academic credentials. We do about 500,000 each year. And generally, we open doors for individuals, whether they're immigrants, international students, refugees, to either go back to higher education, to get licensed, or to basically go into employment. I need to make a comment around a comment that was made a little bit earlier around the issue of barriers that are faced for academic credentials. We do academic assessments, and we do it really successfully. The issue is really very much about how are those experiences that people bring, how do those experiences move into the Canadian context? I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I just want to separate out academic credentials and experience assessment.
Okay, well, let's start with a bird's eye view by talking about the biggest challenges that young people face when they're attempting to access good jobs, so high quality jobs and starting their careers. Why don't we start at the other end? Shamira.
Sure. So I'm going to focus very much on youth, and although we have talked about the gaps in terms of young people not being able to access jobs, the focus is really on refugee and immigrant youth. And one of the issues that we don't really think about in a very intentional way is we think about youth as just a general population. But when you think about immigrant and refugee youth, they have a very different experience. They're either basically children of immigrants who are struggling themselves, or they're refugees where young people have come here, or they might be international students. And so they have very unique experiences in terms of trying to integrate into the labor market. And even if they do, they're basically in really low-paying jobs, and so there is no future. One of the biggest issues for young people and the unique experience that they face, which is a negative experience, is no social capital. So whereas we have, basically children where we can open doors, where we have friends and community, with immigrant and refugee youth, they have nowhere to turn. And so what ends up happening is that they're struggling. So you have basically two generations now struggling. Immigrants and newcomers are highly skilled, and basically their children. And so, you know, for me, these are issues that at World Education Services, we've gone deep into, look at statistics, and then we have some solutions that I could offer as we talk about them.
So these were some of the challenges that were covered in a report that World Education Services released recently called Immigrant Youth in Canada's Labour Market. So we'll come back to that.
Sure.
Ian, what do you see as being some of the largest challenges?
Well, you know, as mentioned in previous panels, you know, we really do feel that international students are a key piece of the puzzle, and we think that these types of training programs that are specialized and set up to really tackle these opportunities that are emerging are really critical to not just bringing international students in and training them in ways, but ensuring that they have a pathway to very successful careers. And we absolutely think that this space of computational agriculture is a really expanding area that we can really attract students to and bring them to Canada for.
Okay, well, more on that. And Agapi, what do you see as being some of the largest challenges?
I definitely think social capital is one of them, and much to just piggyback off of what she was saying, I think that we need to also recognize that people, Black youth specifically, because that's really what I'm representing here on this stage, is the reality is they're first or second generation immigrants. And so that struggle of their parents coming to this country continues on. And there's actually statistics that Census Canada came out with that shows us that the longer we stay here as Black Canadians, the worse off we are becoming. And so it's about social capital, but it's also about exposure and access. Yes, you know, understanding that you can't go to your parents or your cousin or whomever and say, hey, you know, I'm really interested in working in the newsroom. Can you take me there? And it's also just even acknowledging that those jobs exist. I think exposure is like the #1 thing, access is second, and social capital being third.
Something that we've talked about as well in the lead up to this panel is self-exclusion. So I think you kind of touched on that a little bit, and I'll come back to you as well on that, Shamira. What are some steps, like let's get really granular here, that both parents and employers and education organizations can take to reducing that?
Well, when you say self-exclusion, meaning that the young people are kind of
Young people are, and we hear this too sometimes in hiring, that, oh, I don't see myself either at that organization or in that profession, partly because there hasn't been a history of exposure.
Okay, fair enough. I would probably rephrase that for all of us who are using that and not say it's self-exclusion, because it's not out of their own like will of wanting to be excluded. I think it's like an external factor. I think you don't know what you don't know. Just like any of us who go into a new job or a new experience, you don't know what you haven't been exposed to. And I think we need to start thinking about how are we engaging every Canadian and every community in a unique and different way. When we're talking about young people, you can't just have a paintbrush, just like for the Black community. There's people from the Caribbean, there's people from Africa, there's people from the continent. Like, Blackness is not one thing. And so our approach at C has to be different for each community, even within the Black community. Same thing for all Canadians. We need to be having a different approach of how we're engaging, creating exposure, creating social currency for each group if we really want to, you know, allow success to flourish, and not use things like, you know, self-exclusion, because they're not excluding themselves. They very much want to be a part of it, and we need to create space for that to happen.
So let's, this is maybe a difficult question in such a general forum, but what is one thing that employers can do that would start us on the path to that?
My favorite question.
Could be more than one.
Yes,
but just looking at the time.
Yes, there's so many things, but I will definitely say #1 is you cannot just put a flag in the middle of a community you have no relationship with and be like, we're hiring, and then when no one shows up, be like, oh, well, I tried and nobody applied, so we did our part. That's not how this works. Anything business, you know, it starts with relationship. You need to build relationship with these communities. Find an organization like C or whatever the equivalent is in that community to be an intermediary to bring those young people in, to work with the employers, to train them up. You cannot diversify a workforce that has no history of anyone, you know, even being trained up in it. If it means you need to have a 15-year plan, that takes you to high school students and providing scholarships so that they can enter into it, then that's what you need to do. But you need to have a strategy. You cannot just put, you know, a sign in the middle of a community. It's just not going to work that way.
Yeah, something else, and thank you for that. I think it's really important to have those hard, frank conversations. Shamira, I think you mentioned also the importance of, you know, once you've hired young people, you can't just say, well, that's it, we've done our job. There's more that has to happen. Can you talk about that?
Sure, and that was part of the report. So the first thing, and I'm just building on what Agapi said, is that we can't just basically get into a situation where we'll say, here are the issues and here are the solutions. It has to be for youth, by youth, because they actually know what their issues are. And so it's a matter of getting youth to sit at the table, you know, once you go to the communities. Basically, in terms of, you know, some of the solutions, and, you know, we talk about this with what youth could do and what are the concrete solutions, is work integrated learning. And a lot of the refugee youth and international students are not part of the WILL program that the federal government has funded. And so the way to do that in a very intentional way is when you hire people, you don't have the highest expectations because they haven't had history or